My question for you this morning is, where does our identity come from? It's what we've been studying for the better part of 2.5 months, maybe 3 months. Where does our identity come from? What are you basing your identity on? Where do you get your deepest sense of self? What have you constructed? What are you founded on? Where do you get that sense of who you are? Sheila Walsh, the Christian singer, writer, and former co-host of the 700 Club, told her story, how in 1992, about how her disconnected spirituality caused her to hit a wall. She tells a story about how one morning she was sitting on national television with my nice suit and inflatable hairdo, and that night I was in the locked ward of a psychiatric hospital. It was the kindest thing God could have done to me. She says the first day in the hospital, the psychiatrist asked her, "Who are you?" To which she replied, "Well, I'm the co-host of the 700 Club." He said, "That's not what I meant." She said, "Well, I'm a writer. I'm a singer." He replied, "That's not what I meant either. Who are you?" She replied, "I don't have a clue." And he responded, "Now that's right. And that's exactly why you're here." She goes on to say that she measured herself by what other people thought of her. To the extent that you might have seen a person like that, as we often do, with fame and glory and money and resources. But inside, she was measuring herself by what other people thought of her, and that was slowly killing her. We also can base our identities on things like that, external things. Things that don't come out of the heart, but things that are on the outside, the externals. It could be anything. It could be career. It could be the sense that your career has made it to a certain period, a certain point in your life that's been projected that it's supposed to be, and once you make it, you feel right. And if it doesn't make it, you feel terrible. Some other externals that we can base our identity on are family. Whether you have a family, could be whether you feel successful or fulfilled in life. If you've married the right person, if you have kids, if you have a certain amount of kids. If you have kids, it doesn't even stop. If your kids are well-behaved and make you look like a better parent. We can base our identity off of externals like party politics. In other words, if our connection with God is not deep and strong enough, we might find it in civic religion. We might find it in a series of legislators and a tribe and a partisan group of party politics. It could just be personal autonomy. We love our personal freedom. And if we have a certain amount of flexibility, we feel successful, we feel like we have an identity that is founded on something solid. And even if you don't have any of those things, you still have a body. You might say, at least I can do stuff with my body. I can say what I want to say. I can wake up when I want to wake up. I can tell that person off when I want to. Dallas Willard once famously commented that the kingdom of the human personality is the body. That is your realm by which you can rule. The Bible has language for all of these things, whether it's career or family or finances or flexibility or personal autonomy or partisan politics or the physical body. The Bible simply uses one word to describe all of those things. It uses the word kingdom. A kingdom is simply an area or a space of rule and influence. It might be a big rule, a big space of rule and influence, or it might be small, but it's your area. It might just be your body. Like, this is my space right here. Don't get in my space. Don't tell me what to do. This is mine. Or it could be a huge gamut of all of the things I mentioned, maybe even more. But your identity is often based on whatever your kingdom is. Wherever you're able to exert rule and influence. And if you're able to exert enough rule and influence, you might have a good identity. That's my first point. Your identity is based on your kingdom. The reason I wanted to read Hebrews chapter 12 is because what the author of Hebrews, some say Paul, some say it's Apollos, some say it's Priscilla, whoever it is, the author of Hebrews, uses a picture of two mountains to describe what I want us to land on. That there are ultimately only two types of kingdoms by which you can base your identity on. And he uses metaphors loaded with Old Testament imagery. And one of the things that we see in Hebrews chapter 12 is that there are some kingdoms that destroy. You might think that they're pushing you along. You might think that you're getting a certain amount of success from them, that they're helping you, but they ultimately destroy. Listen to what he says in verse 18 through 20. He says, "You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire." Now, without any context on this, you might get lost, but just a quick update. What the author here is speaking about is some allusions from the book of Exodus when the people of Israel were at Mount Sinai. That was the mountain. And Moses went up on the mountain to receive God's law, and it was scary. The power of God was falling, his presence was falling, the glory of God. And that is where Moses receives the Old Covenant. So what the author of Hebrews is talking about, metaphorically speaking, is the Old Covenant. That element where we are, that place where we are unable to approach the throne of God because he's simply too holy and we are too sinful. Where God's word is actually burdensome because we can't live up to it. We can't bear it. And as the author would say, the people of Israel begged that no further word would be spoken to them by God because they couldn't bear what was commanded. In other words, it's our sin that makes us incompatible with God. God is glorious, he's wonderful, he is better than, he is completely holy. We have missed that mark, and yet we were created for him. And what does that end up looking like? Mount Sinai. Where we cannot possibly enter into the presence of God because he's too holy and we are too sinful. But we were made for his presence. And so what happens when people try to find their identity without the presence of God? We tend to build our own kingdoms. We tend to try to find our identity in other things. And this is what Sinai becomes a picture of. Those kingdoms where we are central to the kingdom and where we are trying to sustain ourselves, our own lives, and our own identity. The problem is, like Sheila Walsh would admit, our kingdoms simply cannot sustain our identities. And so we crash. There's not enough money to go around. Our careers never quite seem to fulfill that deep need inside of us. Our kids can't bear the burden of our immaturity, our need for love and acceptance. Our spouses are never quite as perfect as we would hope that they would be. And so the windows and the ceiling of our kingdoms cave in. There are some kingdoms that destroy. What are those? All those in which we are central and trying to sustain ourselves. And then the author of Hebrews turns a corner. He talks about a different kingdom or a different mountain. There is a kingdom that lasts. Now he goes on in verse 22. Look at this. He says, "But you have come to Mount Zion." Now he's speaking to Christians, right? He's saying, you have no longer come to that old mountain, a metaphor for the law, the old covenant, all that it speaks of, in which we try to sustain our own identities by ourselves and apart from God. He says, you don't go to that mountain anymore. You go to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. He says later, you have come to God, the judge of all, the Spirit of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. There's a lot right there, right? What's he saying, first of all? You've come to a different mountain. You've come to Mount Zion. Now, there's a lot of disagreement on what Mount Zion is. Most people think it is a hill on the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem. But in the author of Hebrews, in his mind, he's speaking of all that encapsulates, what it stands for and represents. You have come to a new covenant. You have not come to that old way of trying to appeal to God. You have not come to that old mountain that stands for the ways that we try to relate to God through our own work, through our own self-sustaining efforts. You've come to a new mountain, to Mount Zion, a picture of a new covenant where you are brought into God's holy presence through the blood of Jesus Christ. Then he says something at the end. He says, where Jesus' blood speaks louder or speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. What does that mean? Well, if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, where the first murder happens, Cain kills his brother Abel out of a fit of jealousy. God says to him, he says to Cain, that Abel's blood is crying out from the ground for judgment. This is what the author of Hebrews is speaking about. Abel's blood cries out for judgment, but Christ's blood cries out for forgiveness and redemption. His blood cries out a better word than the condemnation that we deserve. And so what is this? This is a picture of two mountains as we speak about where we establish our identities. Zion is all those kingdoms where God is central and we learn to rely on Him through faith. Sinai are all those kingdoms where we are central, trying to sustain ourselves. Zion is where God is central and we learn to rely on Him step by step, minute by minute, grace to grace, faith to faith. And this is what Hebrews tells us is the only kingdom that lasts. In fact, he would say in verse 28, we have received a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And so at this point, you might say, great, let's call it a day, break for lunch, sing some songs. God's kingdom is better. If only it were that simple. The question we might be asking on the heels of this is, why doesn't everyone then choose God's kingdom? If God's kingdom, if His way of life is better than any other way, if we could live the most fulfilled and satisfied life by releasing our control of our own lives and surrendering to Him, why doesn't everyone do it? I want to posit in my second point that God's kingdom is a huge challenge to your kingdom. It's hard to let go of our kingdom. It's hard to let go of control. It's hard to let go of those spaces that we occupy, that we look to find a sense of our identity. And it's increasingly difficult to do that here in our culture. In the West, our kingdoms often revolve around a sense of personal freedom. And yet God's kingdom often revolves around worship of God. It's very difficult to follow Jesus in the West because it grates against the idea of personal autonomy. I love this quote by the author Mark Sayers. It's kind of a lengthy one, but wanted to keep it whole. I'm just going to read it from the top. He says, "The Western life system has formed us in a particular way that creates people who resist the move of God in subconscious ways. We don't even know we're doing it. The average Westerner is a radical individualist who is deeply afraid of compromising their autonomy. He or she determines their self-worth and identity primarily horizontally, via media, culture, or peers. We are shaped by the passive-aggressive tone of consumerism where we, listen to this, we want maximum say with minimum responsibility. We are shaped primarily by our fluid and ever-shifting feelings. We yearn for community and connection, yet we fear commitment and consistency. We wish for justice while desiring hedonistic payoffs. We religiously point the fingers at others while jealously guarding our own right to do as we please. All of these factors place us in a spiritually precarious place. It's difficult to follow Jesus, who demands everything, in a culture and a society that strongly idolizes personal freedom. And that's why God frequently and strongly challenges the way people live and value. the way we live and the values we have. I just want to bring out a couple lines from our text in which he does this, perhaps to some of us, maybe to all of us. Look at verse 28. He says, worship God acceptably. Just the fact that he threw in that phrase acceptably might rub you the wrong way. If he simply said worship God, maybe most of us in this room would be like, yeah, I love that. But putting in that little disclaimer that there's a way to do it properly grates against our sense of personal freedom. Wait a minute. I want to worship God the way that I worship God. I want to relate to God on my own terms. You see that language coming out of our hearts. And so since we're leaving the autonomy of our own kingdoms where we're in control, it makes sense that we're pledging allegiance to another and to its rule, in this case, God's. What does it mean to worship God acceptably? What does that even mean? I think of the passage in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, where Paul says, therefore, brothers and sisters, in light of God's mercy, I want you to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, which is your acceptable act of worship. Again, using Old Testament language, what is a sacrifice? It's the death of your life. And Paul actually turns that around with a clever hook. He says, I want you to offer yourself as a living sacrifice, meaning you're not dead physically, but you're dead to yourself. This is a complete reversal of allegiances. You used to live for yourself. Now I want you to offer every part of you to God in allegiance. That is acceptable worship, which might be a complete turnaround from what some of us expected. We might assume worship just has to do with how I feel in the moment. I feel connected to God, so I must be worshiping him well. I had a really bad day. I don't want to sing. I'm not worshiping well. When the truth is, the fact that you show up for worship when you don't feel like it might actually be a better posture and expression of worship than just feeling it well. Because what is worship? What is acceptable worship? It is giving allegiance to God instead of to yourself. It is offering your whole life as a living sacrifice, saying, God, I am no longer in control of my agenda, of my life, of my 5-year plan, of my feelings, of my thought life, of my do's and my don'ts. I want you to take it and I want to follow you in that. Acceptable worship. Now, I want to pause here for a second to interact with some of the irking feelings. I think I just made that up. That some of you may have with the rigid requirements that it seems like God has with worship. Like, why can't I just step into the throne room of God and just relate to him the way that I want to? Why does God have, if he's loving, have such rigid requirements of the way that I interact with him? And I want to draw your attention to answer that question to the end of verse 28, where it says, God is a consuming fire. For our God is a consuming fire. Let us be thankful and worship God acceptably with reverence and awe because God is a consuming fire. Now, when the author of Hebrews describes God in this way, he is directly quoting a passage in Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 23 through 24. I'm just going to read the whole thing for you, where God says, take care. This is to the people of Israel. Take care lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and instead of that covenant, you make a carved image or an idol, the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden you. In other words, if I can paraphrase that, he's saying, don't worship other idols, worship only the Lord your God. And then he goes on to say, because or for the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Now, that's a weird thing to describe God as, right? How many of you are like, that makes no sense? Jealousy is something maybe you've attributed to some impulsive, capricious young child who doesn't get what they want or doesn't get what they feel they deserve and is acting out jealousy. And besides, doesn't the Bible describe jealousy as bad? In Galatians chapter 5, it's not a part of the kingdom of God. It is an element of the flesh. How then can we possibly describe God as a jealous God? Isn't jealousy wrong? Now, what makes jealousy wrong is that we often are jealous over things that we don't have. And that's the difference between us and God. Everything belongs to God. When I'm jealous of you, I'm jealous from a place of discontentment and resentfulness because you have something I feel like I deserve. When God is jealous for something, he's jealous of something that was taken from him. Now, this still may sound narcissistic to you for God to be jealous, but I want you to consider the story of an old dog I used to have. Her name was Bailey. She was a Cocker Spaniel. She was everything. She was about yay big, but she acted like she was this big. And we used to have, she was my only dog for a period of time, and we had this tiny brown football, plastic football that squeaked when Bailey bit the dog, or bit the ball. Sometimes bit dogs too, and they squeaked. And I'd throw it, she'd waddle around like a little hunting dog, flapping around, ears just flailing, grab it back to me, and that would be our routine. Until we added to the family another dog. This dog's name was Chewy. And Chewy was a cross between a boxer and a Doberman Pinscher. And it was this big, but acted like it was this big. And one day, for the first time, I decided to play catch with my dogs, and actually just Bailey, the Cocker Spaniel, threw the football, and she, like she had done thousands of times before, just flopped around, down the backyard to get the ball. Chewy turns around, sees the ball, lunges, and in perfect form, jumps over Bailey's head, actually lands hind legs on the top of her head, grabs the ball, brings it back to me. But in that second, Bailey has a reaction. She whips around, lets out a scream, bites the hind leg of Chewy, who then drops the ball, runs into a corner. Bailey picks up the ball, trots over to me like nothing ever happened, drops it at my feet, and establishes herself as the alpha dog very quickly. Now, I share that story because Bailey was jealous. She wanted my full attention over the other dog. But nobody thinks of a Cocker Spaniel as being narcissistic. We think of Cocker Spaniels as being loyal and protective and loving. Now, I'm not comparing God to a Cocker Spaniel. But in the same way, if God is actually who you were made for, and there are things in your life that are keeping you from who you were made for, it is perfectly loyal and protective and loving for him to be jealous of us. To refuse to share you with false gods and empty kingdoms. Our jealousy is often from resentment and discontentment. His jealousy is over what rightfully belongs to him. Our jealousy makes us bitter. His jealousy saves our life. And what is God's jealousy? What does his loving jealousy look like on a day-to-day basis in your life? I want to read one more section of this passage, verse 26 and 27. It says, "At that time, his voice shook the earth." Speaking of that time on Mount Sinai when the whole mountain was shaking because he was speaking, it says, "At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens." The words "once more" indicate the removing, listen to this, the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. I'm going to read that one more time. He is removing what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. What does God's jealous love look like in your life? It looks like all those times where God is shaking stuff that's temporary in your life in order to make room for that which is eternal. What does God's jealous love look like in your life? It's all the shaking that's happening that you can't make sense of right now. It's God shaking the temporary in your life, the created things, in order to make room for the eternal things to remain. Now, this starts when you're born again, where you are introduced to a better Lord, a better God, a better master, and in that moment you surrender for the first time and he shakes things up. But it also continues. It's actually what God uses to provide an enduring identity. God's kingdom provides an enduring identity. That's why God often shakes what's comfortable in your life. I think some of you in this room are experiencing a little shakeup. Where you're like, God, what's happening? Life was so easy up until like last month. Things were so convenient. Things were so prosperous. Things were so easy and nice. And now everything is just being shaken up underneath me. Why are you doing this to me? Sometimes God will shake the temporary in your life in order to deepen or make room for the eternal. Some of you are experiencing that right now. And you might be asking a lot of why questions. And I don't know the details or the ins and out or the implications directly in your life. What I do know is that he often does this in order to reveal what matters. And we've been speaking for months about what matters to the Christian. 3 things to set your identity on: who Christ is, who we are in Christ, and what it means to identify with Christ. That is that kingdom that never fades, where the new man or the new woman is being made fully alive when they're most fully in Christ. God's kingdom will provide an enduring identity. And sometimes, in order to do that, God has to shake up some of the stuff on the surface that you're clinging to, that you love, that you're finding your hope in. Sometimes it might be a career. Sometimes it might be family stuff. Sometimes it might be a friendship. Sometimes it might be money. Sometimes it might be children. Sometimes it might be unemployment. Sometimes it might be difficulty or conflict at work. Sometimes it might be. And God will sometimes use the difficulties in our life to get our attention and to deepen our faith in Him so that we will remain. Where does that leave us? I think there's 2, and I'm just going to try to make this as simple as possible. 2 applications. 1, we see this in the last line. Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. Let's talk about worship. To worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, we just spoke about that, means to surrender whatever God is shaking in our lives to Him. Some of you are going through shaking right now, and you can't make sense of it. Perhaps you're starting to lose your faith and trust in God. Maybe you're asking questions, you're struggling with doubt, maybe you're confused. And I hope that this would be a comfort to you today. That sometimes life happens and we can't control it, but that never thwarts the plan of God in the midst of our lives. He doesn't just use the affluence and the comfort and the peace and prosperity. He also uses the shaking to form you into the person that He's destined you to be. And so as a word of encouragement or comfort to you, instead of giving up in the middle of the shaking, start to reframe the questions you're asking. God, what are you doing in my life right now? And what are you calling me to surrender so that I can experience more of your love, more of your grace, more of your presence? The second thing that I find interesting that the author of Hebrews throws in here is he throws in at the end, let us be thankful. That sense of gratitude that I think keeps people grounded when worship is really difficult. That sense of gratitude that keeps us centered when it's really hard to trust that God is actually doing a good work. It's that filter by which we view our lives, whether it's good or bad, whether there's good things or bad things happening in our lives, that keeps us remembering what's important. And so you might be experiencing a shaking in your life right now. And yet, because of that gratitude, because of that thanksgiving, because of that assumption that God is always good and that you are part of an unshakable kingdom and a God who is a consuming fire, who is jealously in love with you, you can say in the middle of trial and tribulation, I don't know why this is happening. I can't explain it, and I don't even know how to get out of it. But whatever God is doing, it's always going to come from a place of loyalty. It's always going to come from a place of protection. It's always going to come from a place of love. The question we should be asking is, are we listening to God as He's doing that? The best way to open your heart to listen is to simply be thankful, knowing, believing, assuming that God is shaping you into who He wants you to be. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Robert, Colette, can you guys come on out here? I want to kind of frame the next few minutes as we continue to sing, as we take the elements, as we carve out both time and space to be in the presence of God, to encourage you to rethink what gratitude and worship means to you. Whether there's shaking happening in your life or whether you're going through just the best season you've ever experienced, remembering to stop. We're in the middle of Thanksgiving week right now, where we have the opportunity to be thankful for a lot of things, but I want to bring it back home to a kingdom-minded gratitude, not merely a consumeristic gratitude. I'm thankful for my car, I'm thankful for food, I'm thankful for my stuff. And to say, maybe in the midst of not having any of those things, maybe in the midst of loss, trial, tribulation, sorrow, and grief, the Spirit of the living God could open up your eyes to still experience a gratitude that can shape the way that you live. I know it's sometimes difficult to be thankful when the world is caving in on you. And so for that, I want to challenge you to just simply listen to the Spirit of God who loves you so much, who maybe in the middle of all of this shaking is attempting to speak to your heart and to your mind. And maybe all you need to do right now is to listen. I know this seems super simplistic, but the Bible over and over and over constantly commands God's people to give thanks. And I think, at this point in my life, I just suspect that it's just one of those spiritual disciplines that opens our hearts and our minds to hear what God is already speaking in the middle of the mess. So you being shaken up today, you're in good company. And in the midst of that shaking, I want to challenge and invite you as well to start the rest of our next few minutes of musical worship together with gratitude. God, as difficult as this is for me to say, I thank you that you have not left me alone. I thank you that you have saved me. I thank you that you're still with me, even though I don't feel you. I thank you that you are a God who saves. I thank you that you are a God who loves. I thank you that you're jealous for me. No one's ever been jealous for me before in my life. Whatever it is, I just challenge you to start thinking up reasons to be thankful. And as your heart is shaped by that spiritual discipline, may the Lord overwhelm you with His love and His grace. And as He does that, let's continue to push further and further into acceptable worship. Not just singing and making melody with our lips and mouthing words and lifting hands, but doing all of that to reflect what's happening on the inside. Christ, you are the unshakable kingdom. And it is my great joy and honor to surrender and to release control to follow you.